The Witches of Rock Cemetery. I have always been a fan of urban legends and myths. I would spend most of my day just browsing through the internet looking for legends and myths in the area that I live in. I thought I had read most of the legends and myths, that is until my parents told me about a legend that so happened to be a true story that happens 200 to 300 years ago when witchcraft was alive and well in the city. I sat down next to the open coal fire and listened to the crackle of the flames before turning my attention to my parents, whom are now sitting in their chairs, my mum with a glass of wine and my dad with a glass of brandy. My dad asks me, "Have you heard of Rock Cemetery that lies just on the outskirts of town? I pass that place every time I go into town." "Yes," I said. "Well, this is where the story begins. About 200 to 300 years ago in this city, there was 3 well-known witches that used to live in a cave in that very same cemetery. No one ever known about them as they kept to that cave and never came out. That is until All Hallows Eve. When Halloween came, these witches came out of the cave about 3 a.m., that would be the witching hour, he told me. I asked, "What is the witching hour?" "The witching hour is where the veil between our world and the afterlife is at its weakest. It is also said that at this time you can summon the devil." The witches would come out of their cave at 3 a.m. and go hunting for any kids that may still be wandering around after they are done their trick-or-treating. If they did find a child, then they would take them back to the cave where they would sacrifice the child to the devil for everlasting life. These witches was found after too many children had disappeared. They had reports of people seeing these 3 witches luring children in the cave at Rock Cemetery. The witches was arrested, put on trial and then burned at the stake. However, anyone who visit the cemetery at the time on Halloween, the spirits of the witches will put them into a trance and lured into the cave, where the witches would sacrifice them to the Dark Lord. Now, intrigued by the story my parents told me, I just had to go and see if there was any truth to the story. I do know that when sitting on the top deck of the bus, you can see caves in that cemetery that are now barred off. After the story, I ran up to my room where I got my phone and rang my friend. I tell him about the story and ask if he would like to accompany me to the cemetery and see if there is any truth to the story. Knowing my friend is into the goth lifestyle, I knew that he wouldn't be able to resist going to a cemetery and checking out that cave. We made a plan to meet up at the cemetery gates at 3 a.m. on Hallows Eve. Walking up to the gates of the cemetery, I can see my mate, who has this very excited look on his face. "Nice to see you, are you ready?" I asked. The gates themselves was locked, so we had to climb over and made sure that the gatekeeper didn't see us. We didn't know the layout of the cemetery as we have never been before, but we did know where the cave was and the route to the cave, so we made our way there. Now at the barred cave, I looked inside and it just looked like a shallow cave to me, that is until my mate pointed out a corridor right in the corner. Strange, I thought, as you wouldn't notice it. We looked for a way in but couldn't find one until we tried pulling on the bars. They came away from the wall as if someone had deliberately took the screws out to get access. We went into the cave and down the corridor. The corridor led into a bigger cave. However, what we saw we could not believe. There right in the middle was an altar. The altar itself was standing inside of the pentagram with bones littered around the sides of the cave. A shivering chill went down my spine and I became really nervous all of a sudden. Me and my mate suddenly froze and we heard a crackling laugh from not 1 but 3 women. We looked at each other and couldn't believe what we heard. Then came the footsteps. "We need to hide," I told my friend, who nodded in return. Luck enough there was a small wall that we could kneel behind. We waiting and watched as we saw 3 ghostly figures appear into the cave. I couldn't believe what we was seeing. The story my parents told me was true. We watched the ghostly figures as they gathered around the altar and perform rituals, just like they would had back in the day. It seems that the ritual was a rewind of their heinous crime they had committed back in the day. It seemed like hours before we could make our escape, when the coast was clear. We made sure to tiptoe out of the cave and out of the cemetery. I didn't want them to see us. Now outside the cemetery gates, we ran all the way home, never speaking of the night ever again.